We're very thankful to have the infrastructure to run this session today. We heard a lot of really, I think, interesting things in Mike's presentation. They're going to continue to come up over the course of the day. You know, this need for integration, focus on things thinking about how we do this work better together. So I'm going to pass things off to
permission to share the computer talking to me. He oversees the GIS department, a team of environmental experts in disciplines such as water, air, land, and wildlife, and oversees the implementation of area-based analysis. So if you're all ready to go there, Sean, I will hand it over to you.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you there.
We can. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you here as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. And I think I have control. There we go. Can everyone see the slides? Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to come and present what the BC Oil and Gas Commission has done around area-based analysis. I do apologize for not being able to participate in the full workshop amount. I will be following up with Chris and Madeline at the end of the day and contributing where we can going forward. To get prepared for the workshop, Madeline sent me a great cheat sheet. It's called the CIRC Workshop Facilitator Guide, and it kind of outlined the workshop objectives, what was being looked at. And as I read through it, a couple of things kind of popped out that were pretty interesting that I used in preparing my presentation. And what kind of highlighted a couple of points is developing new tools for assessing cumulative impacts of resource development. And then a phrase that caught my eye was discussing how CIRC can best support ongoing work, including local decision-making processes around the issues of cumulative impacts. So when I read through that, I kind of I had some questions and some things that I'll address in my talk that I hope hit kind of what the workshop is trying to get at. So what I wanted to cover was three broad things today. Is just to provide an overview of area-based analysis, what it is, provide a perspective on how area-based analysis fits in relation to other provincial cumulative effects programs. And this kind of follows up nicely with what Mike was saying about the regional municipality has certain things it can do and certain things that it can do. When you look at the hierarchy of the cascading provincial cumulative effects programs, there are certain things that the Commission can do and certain things that it can't. So I'll provide a bit of perspective on that. And then I think hopefully this is kind of the right thing to bring up, is to challenge CIRC to clarify how and where the new tools for assessing cumulative impacts of resource development, how those tools can be used to affect change. So how are they going to fit in and start moving the process and affecting change? So we'll look at a bit of background on what area-based analysis is. Pardon me, I've got three screens going here, and I just want to make sure. Okay. So what is area-based analysis? And it's going to be used by the Commission in Northeast BC. You can see the tight gas plays identified in the various colors on the map. What ABA is, it's a systematic method of analyzing cumulative impacts of all industrial development when making decisions on oil and gas applications. The reason that the Commission went to this type of initiative is that there was a variety of strategic direction from various statutes and regulations and existing land use plans that the Commission wanted to clarify those objectives from all those different sources. We also wanted to measure the current condition of some broad values. We have 9 that we want to work on. We have 2 that are in operation. We have 1 that's going to be rolled out soon. So we have riparian that's in play right now, Old Forest, and we'll be rolling out wildlife soon. Area-based analysis also is a cumulative effect tool, a land-based assessment tool. We're able to look at finer scale values, so ecological values such as specific riparian features or Old Forest habitat features that are nested where they co-occur within broad landscape values across the region. So when we're talking about riparian and riparian reserve zones, it's not just the reserve zones on the ground, it's the habitat features within those that area-based analysis is trying to manage. The reason we do that is that by nesting the finer scale values with some broad values, we do that based on a common ecological process, how those finer scale values respond to management or threats, and they can be treated or managed similarly to the broad scale values. It's a common approach that BC has. I think a lot of jurisdictions use to manage the complexity of the land base. ABA wanted to provide a simplified and fairly transparent framework so that we can assess and manage oil and gas impacts on environmental values. And because the assessment of the current condition or the footprints includes the impact of other sectors on the ground, so we include transmission lines, we include railway, we include cut blocks, roads, etc., wind farms. Because the impacts of other sectors are also factored in, it also measures the cumulative effects of disturbance across the land base on specific values. One of the big drivers that the Commission really wanted is we wanted to implement a tool. There's been a lot of work. I think those familiar with the cumulative effects field know that there's been a lot of work over the years on a variety of cumulative effects programs. A lot of them are project-based. So what's the impact that an LNG facility is going to have in an area? What's the impact of a coal mine on an area? What's the impact of a variety of large-scale development? So it's a project-level assessment. The Commission wanted to break out of that thought process and dive into something that was transactional, that fit where we were making our decisions. We get about 4,000 applications a year, and we wanted to have a tool that we could use to help calculate and look at the impact of approving a particular application on the environment. So we wanted an operational implementable tool. What this diagram shows is the kind of the framework that we use. This is the key to the decision-making process in area-based analysis. And there's some basic principles that are factored into all of the values that we will be managing. As industrial build-out increases, the impact to the value increases, as you can see on the graph. And the line up through the middle is a representation of that impact. As you can imagine, you would have different rates for different values. For something that is much more sensitive to industrial build-out, that line would be a lot steeper. For a particular value that has a bit more resilience, that line may be flatter. What we do with area-based analysis is we assess the current condition of a particular value, and we plot it on this type of framework. And the difference between the current condition that would be out on the land base and the regulatory policy trigger, the top line, that defines the envelope of acceptable future developments. However, application requirements, data, additional adjudication, review, and/or permitting conditions are implemented when the current condition reaches a lower enhanced management trigger. So it's a line that provides an indication that the impact on the particular value is increasing due to industrial build-out, and there's a variety of things that that are imposed upon the Commission in terms of enhanced review. We require mitigation plans from proponents, when they're in that area. We may put special permit conditions on an application. So it's an escalation. So one of the principles as well is that management response escalates as the impact of the value increases. This framework is developed for each of the values. When values overlap, and as they do, each of them is assessed separately and actioned individually. So where we have old forest in our riparian reserve zone, we assess each separately, and permit conditions are going to reflect the value. We also provide maps for each of the values, and I have some examples of those. They're color-coded, as you can see here. They're available online. Most of the proponents, oil and gas companies, access the data, and they have their planning processes incorporate the data we've provided. And what we're noticing is that we have seen two trends that are really kind of interesting. One, we've seen even factoring in the downturn in the industry, we're seeing fewer and fewer applications in the areas that we have identified as being above the enhanced management trigger. So the best outcome from area-based analysis is that we would never see an application in an area we've identified as being above the enhanced management trigger. So avoidance. And what we're seeing is on a percentage basis, the amount of applications coming in areas that are yellow is much less than it has been in the past. Another thing we're also seeing is that the amount of area that has been disturbed is increasing. So the reuse of disturbed area is also increasing. So not only are companies avoiding areas, but they're minimizing the impact of new footprint by utilizing existing disturbance. So we have an operational tool that we use. It's a GIS-based system that supports our application review process. Every application that comes in from a company is submitted through a web portal. It goes through a screening process, and what you see depicted here is just a screen grab of some information that is available for our decision makers. So you could imagine a new proposal, and let's say that fairly straight line going through the middle of the slide is a new pipeline. That shape is brought into the GIS. It's analyzed. The values that area-based analysis tracks are highlighted. You can see in the hatched areas here. Wherever that proposed area intersects the AVA values, a report is produced and summarized for the decision maker. It's a fairly straightforward process. The decision, what area-based analysis tool does is it looks at the aggregate of all of the disturbance in a particular area, adds the incremental disturbance if it was approved, and provides a forecast of the new impact on the land base if the application was approved. That information is then brought to the decision maker, and it's compared with the information that's provided in the mitigation plan from the company. It's a fairly modular process so that we can add new values fairly easily into the tool. And that was by design. We wanted to be able to keep it modular and adaptable. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So I've used the word values quite a few times. What are we talking about? To start, the area-based analysis is pulling the values from our legislation. So Mike talked about working within some prescribed areas. This is where the Commission is starting, is working within the prescribed areas that the legislation directs us to make environmental decisions on. So for the land, we have old forests and riparian habitats are the two that we're managing right now. We're in the midst of rolling out a wildlife value for designated areas. Cultural heritage is a broad category that we would like to incorporate into area-based analysis. We have a water quantity component that we operate outside of area-based analysis. It's through a tool called NEWT, or the Northeast Water Tool, and it looks at the cumulative impact of existing water allocations as well as proposed allocations or proposed licenses. We want to look at water quality and groundwater, and we'll be working in conjunction with the BC Ministry of Environment and FLNRO as we move forward to ensure that what we implement is in lockstep with the provincial initiatives around water quality and groundwater and air quality as well. So that's the suite of proposed values that we'll be looking at incorporating in area-based analysis. What we have here is, I had mentioned earlier about maps. This particular one shows a few things. It's the Old Forest Value Map. We've used some very broad ecological units called natural disturbance units that researchers in forest lands and natural resource operations have used. They're fairly large and it's problematic, and we've received a substantial criticism around the size of these units and are working on moving towards smaller assessment units. But you can see the lines here represent, there's 6 broad units, and what the color scheme shows is the where there is sufficient old forest that is below the enhanced management trigger, and the yellow is showing in areas along the east slopes where we are above the enhanced management trigger. Where did my cursor go? The next value that I have a map for is riparian value. In this particular one, we have 69 water management basins, and you can see the outlines, the dark outlines here. And they are shaded, the riparian reserve zones are shaded here according to the rating. It's a different rating for the enhanced management trigger and the regulatory policy trigger. Each value has its own set of triggers. And so again, this map is provided to industry. The third area that we will be rolling out very soon is designated wildlife value. And what we're starting with is it's based on the FLNRO's wildlife habitat areas and ungulate winter ranges. So we've taken all of the disturbance data and assessed the individual impacts by either wildlife habitat area or ungulate winter range. A series of permit conditions and escalations will be developed for each of these individual polygons. So you can imagine in some areas, if you could take all 3 of these maps and smoosh them together, you may have a designated wildlife value that is below the enhanced management trigger. You have a old forest value that is above the enhanced management trigger, and a riparian value that is above the enhanced management trigger. We treat all of those separately, and the specific, if the application is approved, there will be specific permit conditions targeting the riparian and the old forest. So that's my quick summary of area-based analysis. One of the things that I wanted to try and cover here, just get my slide ready, is this waterfall diagram. And what I'm trying to show here is that there's a cascading level of assessment, each fitting within the above. And I think this may describe some of the environment that Mike was talking about initially. Is that you start off provincially, you have some, and whether very broad overarching components of resource management are established. Legislation and policy, setting direction, how are you going to administer resource management provincially? Administrative law principles in decision making, statutory decision makers, designated decision makers. It's a very formalized process. There's people may have heard about professional reliance in planning and assessments. This is all decided at the provincial level. Land use plans. So, and I'm just going to talk about the left-hand side of this waterfall diagram first, before we talk about how cumulative effects, I think, is integrated on the right-hand side. So, cumulative effects at a broader level can be used to help clarify and modify some of the concerns. So, you've got higher-level plans, analysis. You have interaction between the two. And provincially, where you have new objectives, where you want to modify objectives, or where you want to rebalance objectives, this is generally where it starts to occur. And the objectives may be socioeconomic, it may be decision-making, it may be environmental, and what happens on the land use. At the regional level, so the next one down, this may be the Northeast BC, it may be Northern Rockies regional municipalities. So it's a smaller level. Here what you've got going on is you've got an adjustment or modification, customization of the provincial direction for local conditions, regional conditions. And so what you have here is a whole series of legislation and tools that are geared towards regional planning, regional analysis, regional interaction, and generally government's broader objectives are starting to be implemented. That's where the rubber meets the road at a regional level here. And if you move down one more level, you get what I call local. And here where you've got individual management responses that are customized to a single application or activity. So if a road is going to be built, what are the on-the-ground conditions of that particular road? How do you reflect the overall objectives that come at the provincial level, through the regional level, and where you place that road? Does it go on spot A or spot B? What are the things you have to consider versus spot A, spot B? The local piece is where you're actually doing something on the ground. So there's this cascading hierarchy of translating broad provincial objectives into local conditions and practices on the ground at the local level. So on the right-hand side, we've got, of course, it's nothing in BC would be easy. We've got 4 programs to try and translate and communicate and assess cumulative effects. We have a provincial cumulative effects framework. And at the broad level, this particular process can be used to help clarify and develop new or modify, rebalance objectives. So with the tools that have been created, you can look at if there's concerns around not enough wildlife habitat, then at a provincial level, that can be looked at relative to if we're going to have more wildlife habitat in one area, what does that do to less resource development? And so there's a rebalancing of objectives that may happen at the provincial level. And provincial cumulative effects is an excellent tool to help look at the trade-offs and the adjustments between the two. The second process that's underway, and it's relatively new, is this regional strategic environmental assessment. And the RSEA, as it's known, or CIA, it's a collaborative approach between governments and participating First Nations to design a process to assess the effects of development activities on treaty rights, and to come up with the working objective of that particular cumulative effects team is to optimize treaty rights and development. So it's a very purpose-built, very active participatory process to try and reflect and incorporate a new way of balancing development and treaty rights. It kind of spans that middle piece between provincial, regional, and local. And the way I've depicted it that way is that the ARCIA program has, within its mandate, has the ability to have influence on the rebalancing, redefining provincial objectives. It's operating clearly at the regional level. The area of study that's being looked at right now is the Montney Shale play in northeast BC. And what will come out of the ARCIA are very specific new plans, new tactics, new ways of doing business that area-based analysis can take and incorporate and implement on the ground. So ARCIA is in a really unique spot, right in the middle, that has affecting significant change. The next one is the Northeast Cumulative Effects program, the NECE. This was one of the original demonstration projects that was used to help inform and scope out the provincial cumulative effects program. It's in a bit of a, I don't know if Anna Renier is in the room today, if she can make it up. Maybe she could speak to it a little bit more. It will be the mechanism that will be implementing the provincial cumulative effects program. So the Northeast Cumulative Effects was a pilot. It tested a variety of things and informed the overall framework and development of the provincial cumulative effects framework. It's now, the Northeast CE is on hold for a little bit until solid direction comes out of the provincial piece, and then the Northeast Cumulative Effects framework will be modified and adjusted. The reason it's ABA, area-based analysis, is shown there is that it operates at generally the same level as the Northeast Cumulative Effects, kind of this regional, local level. And the reason that there are two of them is that the best way to describe it is that area-based analysis is the cumulative impacts assessment tool that will be used by the Oil and Gas Commission on oil and gas decisions. The Northeast Cumulative Effects Framework will be used to assess cumulative impacts on all other industrial activity on the land base. So we have this parallel assessment process adjusting or targeting different industries. The monitoring program on the bottom is just a stylized representation of the program that FLNRO has right now, called the Multiple Resource Value Assessment, and it's a broad land-based assessment monitoring program that is stepping back and looking at the impact of industrial development on specific values, irrespective of the legislation. So ABA operates within the oil and gas legislation. The MRVA, the monitoring program, is assessing environmental impacts on all developments, or from all developments, irrespective of legislation. So let me just change the slide again here. Okay. So along comes CIRC, and I couldn't really figure out how to depict it on the slide, because when I read through the facilitator's guide, depending on the interest, depending on the concern of and the scope, this particular workshop, it could cover everything that I've just talked about. So I just put it as a foundational piece. you've got concepts that I think are fantastic. We're looking at user-oriented, community-based. The workshop, the initiative, CIRC is kind of an iterative nature. But again, the question that I started with is how do you implement? So CIRC wants to address knowledge gaps in relation to local monitoring. Well, there's a provincial monitoring program going on, so how does it fit? Does it? What about management and decision making? CIRC wants to is challenging the status quo, which is fantastic. How does that fit into this structure that we've talked about here, this cascading, very regimented, top-down, bottom-up feedback system? One of the ideas behind the workshop is to ensure diverse and competing values are maintained and promoted. The system that I've described was designed to do that. Clearly, there's been some concern about the effectiveness of that. So how does CIRC collectively prioritize values at a community level? Been talking about area-based analysis for a while in a variety of forums, and there may be some people in the room that have heard discussions before. I thought I'd provide a bit of some additional things that we have heard that we're working on that may arise today that maybe people are concerned about that bring to the table, and that they're fundamental questions about looking at this framework. So how and when will treaty rights be incorporated into what we're talking about? There's some concerns that we have heard. I'm sure there's people around the table that the existing objectives, so I've talked about riparian, old forest, and wildlife, but they're inadequate for my interest. Another thing that the Commission has heard is we want shared decision making. It has to be incorporated. But what does that mean? We've heard concerns that they want to, rather than operating within the provincial framework around statutory decision makers and discretion and administrative law, that the only way to implement cumulative effects is to have a guarantee that the results will be used by everybody across the natural resource sector in a very predictive way. So it's decision making versus decision support. Mike talked about the need for socioeconomic aspects incorporated. Clearly, I haven't talked about those with area-based analysis, as there's right now it doesn't fit within the Commission's legislative sandbox. The acceptance and management of risk varies amongst stakeholders. I'm sure everyone on the workshop today has a different level of risk when it comes to the environment and what they're willing to accept or not. How do you incorporate that into the decision making? Some are hoping that cumulative effects program will result in slower or less resource developments and want the process to immediately show this. Others want more certainty on the land base for economic planning. And opinions are across the board and vary about how management triggers, what they should be, what the enhanced management triggers should be, what the regulatory policy triggers should be, and how they will be used. So a ton of questions that I've heard that I thought would be a great point to stop with in terms of my discussion, because when it comes back to CIRC and what's being talked about today, is it's great, and the challenge is to, if you want to implement, where do you implement? Do you implement at the monitoring level? Do you implement at the local site level practice with permit conditions? And what happens? Do you implement at the regional level and have specific and want to influence specific objectives for the Northern Rockies regional municipality? Or do you need to start at the provincial level, because what happens in the Northeast is governed by a provincial? So I don't have an answer. I'm just wanted to kind of challenge and put this on the table that in order to effect change and move forward, I would I would like to see as a commission is some specific pieces that come out of the program about okay, Oil and Gas Commission, in order to start moving forward from this particular workshop, these are the things that CIRC is interested in bringing forward. These are the interests, and this is how we see you, Oil and Gas Commission, or you, provincial government, or FLNRO, this is how these things can be implemented. So that's all I have. Thank you for the opportunity, and I guess I can turn it back over to Madeline or Chris.
Thanks so much for that, Sean. It's, and again, a big part of this workshop is providing opportunity, I think, to hear about a whole variety of initiatives and a whole variety of things that are unfolding. And Sean, I think you did a great job of outlining some of the neat initiatives at the provincial, regional, and local level. Since we got started a couple of minutes late, and I know that Sean has to take off, just a really quick reminder that we're happy to collect questions from folks online. There's a little chat box down in this corner. And at the end of all of our presentations, we're actually going to invite the panelists up to the room and really hope to have a bit of a conversation around a variety of different questions that you might have. So feel free to type your questions here, insert them, and we can flag some now for Sean, recognizing that we're short on time before we take a little bit of a health break. So just to prevent people from rushing the line with questions, first I just wanted to open it up to the room and see if there are any questions for Sean in the room.
Chris?
Yeah, Sean.
One thing I will say is the questions as they come up, if there aren't any right now, whenever they come up and they are recorded, I will follow up with you at the end of the day to make sure that we can provide answers to whatever questions get raised today.
Absolutely, Sean. And I'm just making a note here to advance the slides so that we've got your contact information.
Yes.
People want to follow.
I forgot to go to that last one there, so.
No worries. Well, I'm not seeing too many questions right now in the room, but if there are other questions that are coming up from folks online, feel free to enter them. Yeah. So I'm not sure if you could hear that, Sean. That was.
No, I couldn't hear it at all, Chris. So sorry. If you could repeat the question.
Anna just typing in and talking about that they're still working through, I think, the implementation phase, and that's more at the local, regional level for cumulative text assessment. Yeah.
Okay.
So less of a question and more of a comment, I think, Sean. And there's a question here from Mike Gilbert here as well.
Sean, would you care to cite an example of where the provisions of RCA have been activated and what the outcomes have been to this point?
The question there was just thinking about RCA. Sean.
Sorry, Chris, the audio is a bit jumbled. So the question around RCA and the current status?
Perhaps an anecdotal example of the implementation of the provisions there, the opportunities that it affords. So how has it been applied? And what are any outcomes?
So the question there, Sean, is how has RCA been applied? How has it been implemented? And are you aware anecdotally of any particular outcomes that have come through that particular process?
Okay. It's still early stages of development. The team that's working on it is I think there's 5, maybe 6 First Nation communities now. Most of the major provincial agencies, including the Oil and Gas Commission, there's some industry players. It was created initially by it was called the LNG, Environmental Stewardship Initiative, and the RCA was program to help implement and address the concerns around the forecasted developments to supply the LNG facilities and the impact on treaty rights. So there's a broad-based group, and where the group is at right now, they're meeting today. They were meeting yesterday as well. And they're still, well, they've made a fair bit of progress. There's some things that are happening. There's each of the 5 of the 6 First Nation communities are outreaching and working with their specific communities on values of interest. The broader team is kind of in the midst of a fairly passionate discussion around how is the group going to measure treaty rights? How is it going? What values can be mapped, can be described across the land base that reflect treaty rights as understood by the First Nation communities, that can be mapped and looked at and analyzed with forecasted development across the land base. So it's pretty early days, and there's some very heavy discussions. We're in some very heavy discussions about actually, how are you going to do that? A broad concept has been floated around kind of a vision, and it's optimizing treaty rights and development. So you can imagine kind of a spectrum. At one end, you have 100% or your optimization or its maximization of treaty rights and minimal development. At the other end of the spectrum, you have full-on development with minimal or not much management of treaty rights, and then in between you have this optimization matrix. So those are kind of the concepts and the key points that the group has created and are working and moving forward. So nothing concrete has come out that's going to change area-based analysis at this point, but I guess the way I've described it within the Commission is that the sort of affect change on the ground with the current structure that I described in one of my slides. The best output from the Regional Strategic Environmental Assessment is to have areas identified that you can map, and that management and those areas that are mapped identify a specific value, and it could be a specific component of treaty rights. It could be the one that's being talked about is peaceful enjoyment. So what does that look like? How do you describe that? And if you have a line, an area on the map that is identified to be managed for peaceful enjoyment, what do you do differently inside that area than you do outside? That sort of output can be easily incorporated into area-based analysis, the provincial framework. So there's some, as well as the Northeast Cumulative Effects tool. So there's a variety of, if the output comes out, the tools are there to implement. So kind of a long-winded answer to describe more of the kind of the status of the initiative. I could add that. Okay.
I'm noticing there's a quick question that's come through on the chat, and then maybe we'll enter into our break. The question here entered into the chat box asks, area-based assessment doesn't mean issue-based assessment. Example, forest related to biodiversity, concentration, job for forest workers, sacred area for First Nations, ecological services in the water cycle. And the question is, how can we move forward to issue-based approaches? And maybe my reframe of that question to you, Sean, is how can some of those issues, above and beyond, some of the initial values that have been selected for the ABA, are there plans to roll out other things? How do you plan on incorporating other values into that kind of area-based assessment or issues-based assessment kind of focus?
Well, I hate to use this phrase, but it depends on what the issue is. So, in addition to there's a legislative process that the Oil and Gas Commission operates under to review applications and assess potential impacts on a variety of interests. Area-based analysis is additional information that's put into that existing process. So some of the issues that's maybe behind this particular question can be addressed through additional processes outside of area-based analysis that we currently use through stakeholder involvement, consultation, other stream crossings, what might be another one, noise, air quality, things, visuals, so some specific issues get addressed or have the opportunity to be addressed outside of area-based analysis. If there are things that are the best tool or the best way for area-based analysis to operate is in a defined area. So again, conceptually, if an issue can be described and you can put a line around the land base to identify where that issue is, and the issue needs to be addressed differently inside that area than outside the area, then area-based analysis could be the tool that we could modify. I talked about it being a modular process. Area-based analysis could be the tool that would be able to to take that information and incorporate it into our decision-making process. So again, I hate to use it, but it depends on the issue and whether the issue is what we call spatial, so can you put a line around it, or is it better addressed through existing processes?
Thanks for that, Sean. I'm mindful of the time, and we've got a really quick little health break scheduled. So I'm going to suggest, just for the sake of time, maybe we can reconvene here at 11 o'clock, a good opportunity for folks to grab food, coffee, water, use the washrooms. We'll get our next presentation all set up, but in the meantime, please join me in thanking Sean for his presentation on ABA.
Thank you. And like I said, Chris, any questions, I'll follow up with you at the end of the day, and the Commission will answer anything that gets put down today.
We'll look forward to that, Sean, and look forward to reconnecting with you as well. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Enjoy the workshop.
So, folks, for those of you who are on the line, again, we'll reconvene shortly here at 11 o'clock with So welcome back, everyone. We've still got some folks in the room just grabbing coffee, and while we're getting settled after our break, just a good opportunity to introduce our next speaker. So it's a privilege to be introducing Art Verdeen. I've had the privilege of getting to know Art over the course of the last year and a half. Art is a professor of ecosystem science and management and a member of the Natural Resource and Environmental Studies Research Institute at UNBC. He's a longtime professor at UNBC, and he's one of the founding steering committee members for the Cumulative Impacts Research Consortium initiative. So we're delighted to have Art here and talk a little bit about cumulative impacts from the perspective of a natural scientist.
And the slide advancement is just right there, these little arrows.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah. And Evan, for setting this thing up, and it's a real honor, real pleasure to speak to you today. I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can because I think the topic that comes after mine is going to be really relevant, and I'm really hoping to give them as much time as I can. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly,
It's a fairly high-level presentation. I'm a forest ecologist, forest physiologist by expertise and training. But I have much bigger interests. I've worked on a lot of climate change and greenhouse gas effects on ecosystem studies. So I have a very kind of a global scale perspective on things too. And I'm going to start off with that. So go to the next slide here. Just a roadmap. I'm going to give you a little bit of a welcome to the Anthropocene. I'm sure you don't need much of a welcome. You're living in it, and you understand probably some of the reasons why geologists have now renamed this epoch of Earth history after us, because we are such a major force of change right now on the planet. I mean, the cumulative impacts thing is well suited for me because I'm interested in that kind of thing. I want to talk about effects and impacts very quickly because we're doing that a lot today. Talk about some of the current challenges with the cumulative effects assessment arena, and then talk just very briefly about a project that we're just getting off the ground, where we're actually going to kick the tires on this new cumulative effects framework that the province is coming up, and that we heard about a little bit through this area-based assessment approach. And some closing thoughts. I'm going to go through fairly quickly, but I'm hoping that most of this, because it's fairly high elevation, you'll probably have heard quite a bit about this. About the time I was about 8 or 9 years old, we started using more of the Earth than we should. Okay, we're now here. We're using about 1.6, 1.7 Earth's worth for every year of human activity. For example, if we continue on, the business as usual, we're now in overshoot by June 28th. So you're about halfway through the year, and we're in overshoot. And it's business as usual will take us up to a higher level. And if we start to reduce our carbon emissions, for example, just because carbon emissions tend to be very much in keeping with consumer consumption by humans and so on, that it would actually reduce to 1.5, or still half an Earth that we don't have. Yes? Yeah, it's a footprint. So it essentially makes a footprint out of all of our consumptions, impacts, industries, and so, for example, it's easier to think about it in terms of food production, for example. We are actually in a state of maybe 1 billion people on the Earth go hungry every day. So we're essentially consuming more, either by consuming soil, the soil resources, the fertilizers that go into growing crops for food. We're essentially using more than the Earth can replenish every year. Think of water. So if you add up all of those resources that we use, we're using more than the Earth can provide every year. It might be that we're mining aquifers of water in the ground, drawing down water tables, that sort of thing, using up rivers. Many rivers don't even flow to the ocean anymore. They're completely dry river beds by the time they get there. So that's kind of where.
So it's on that, how many foods? So it's just to have it all off. Like if your food all up and
Yeah. This is on an annual basis. So you have to do the modeling. There's no way to really state that because, of course, there's so many variables changing at once. We can chat about this later, but this is from the Global Footprint Network, and so this particular website was Overshoot Day, just talking about when we reach overshoot. So this has been going on since I was a child. We're gradually kind of increasing this, and I think what we really want to do is start bending these curves. I'll talk a bit more about that.
So you're saying that there's a correlation between carbon input and
yes. Now there is a bit of a decoupling.
Causality.
Yeah, it's more of a not causality per se. Yeah, but it does tend to. That's why they talk about carbon emissions there, not
sort of parallels.
It parallels. Now we are uncoupling that a little bit. There are greater efficiencies in some cases, but most of you in the oil and gas industry will know that we're starting to actually go after gas and oil that costs a lot more in terms of emissions to actually get. So the energy in versus energy out is getting more and more narrow all the time. So but I won't go into that too much in this talk, but I'm sure you're familiar with that. So you can't read these graphs, so but you'll see the shapes of the curves. On the left is the socioeconomic trends, starting with human population, which really, because we're in the Anthropocene right now, humans are causing the 6 major mass extinction events. So you can see one of these is extinctions over here in our system trends. But so we're actually causing extinction of life on a level comparable with the 5 major mass extinction events in Earth history, including the one where we lost most of the dinosaurs. So that's because of what we're doing. A lot of it's habitat loss. So if you look on here, there's population, there's GDP. Again, starting at about 1950, this exponential curve. You can look at all of these, foreign investments and so on, paper production, water use. All of those socioeconomic trends tend to mirror the Earth system trends, with some exceptions. But for example, here's the carbon dioxide levels production. Again, exponential increase upwards. Here's the nitrous oxide, methane production. Some of these fugitive emissions from the oil and gas industry again. That's a major concern. Stratospheric ozone. It has stabilized a little bit. This is the upper level ozone that protects us from damaging ultraviolet radiation. So because of the Montreal Protocol, we started to bend that curve. Surface temperature, again, we've had a massive increase recently. Every year in the last 4, I think, year after year, has been warmer than the previous 200 years or whatever in terms of actual measurement. And ocean acidification, again, becoming very worrisome. So anyway, all of these trends, and we're hoping to bend the curve on these. So again, just talking about, I think, cumulative impacts at a very high level. In terms of planetary boundaries, we can see here some that are in the red zone. Again, this came from a science paper by Stefan et al. Planetary boundaries guiding human development on a changing planet. And you can see that, for example, genetic diversity is of major concern here. You can see we're in the red zone there, which is beyond the zone of uncertainty, very high risk. So that's, again, one of the major causes of renaming this epoch of Earth history to the Anthropocene is that we're causing a major mass extinction event. So we have biodiversity integrity going down right now. Functional diversity, this is sort of the different functions that clades of organisms produce. For example, nitrogen-fixing legumes, for example, or plants. That's a functional group, nitrogen-fixing organisms. They're a little less certainty. We don't know too well. Another in the red here, the phosphorus and nitrogen are causing real problems. We're applying these fertilizer rates now at levels that exceed the inputs from the natural systems and inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're actually putting more fertilizer, nitrogen, and phosphorus in the system than nature is. So, and that's causing all sorts of pollution problems. Ocean acidification is just about this zone of concern, this yellow zone. Land system change, which is a big part of what we're talking about here today. That's in an area of increasing risk and concern. It's hard to have wildlife if we don't have habitat. Yeah. Yeah. Conversion of one land type to another, and a lot of that is forest to non-forest, because forests maintain the bulk of the global diversity. So when we change from a forest to a non-forest, or even a simplified forest system, we're losing forests. So cumulative effects. I'm going to have to, I realize I'm already probably losing time here. So these won't come as any I think many people have mentioned these and different examples of how we define cumulative effects. I like this one's very simple from Noble, death by 1,000 cuts, or the tyranny of small decisions. So it's these gradual little things that individually don't seem that important, but you add them up, and soon you have a system that's completely sliced and diced and fragmented, and this is the real issue. And so I think it's probably easier to read this and understand this than these. But the thing that VC system is trying to do is trying to include the social and the economic on top of the environment, which is focused on here by the Canadian system. So the VC system is trying to include these other sectors, and it's also trying to look at the past, present, and future, that crystal ball that you talked about, which is, as we know, really problematic, especially from a scientist standpoint. I always tell my students there is no crystal ball. We just have no way of knowing the future. So, cumulative impacts versus effects. Impacts, the reason why we've called ourselves CIRC is because of a lot of thinking around this, that it's, we've defined the impacts maybe as the effects of effects, and I think others have called it that too. It's the consequences of the effects. For example, we have declining moose levels. Well, the impact would be what that's causing. So we have less moose. We have maybe First Nations not able to meet treaty rights and so on. But there's these effects of effects, and it's the overall emergent properties of all of these cumulative effects that I think we view as perhaps being more meaningful than just the effects themselves. And they're a lot more problematic because you can't necessarily understand those impacts or have a model for those impacts from the effects. But if you go and actually talk to people, or you might actually hear from them these impacts. So cumulative effects, another definition. I'll just leave that for now. Try to move through here fairly quickly. So here's business as usual. Industry 1, causes effects. We run this through our little model and we say, okay, these are the effects, we're okay, right? And so what we know about that now is that that's not adequate. This Industry 1 is not sitting all on its own. It can't be considered on its own, and it has to be considered local, regional, national, and even international levels. So, for example, the Trudeau government has said that they are going to allow us to, or that we should consider I guess you'd say upstream and, upstream. Is that right? Upstream emissions. Yeah, and so one of those aspects is that we now know that greenhouse gases, and we've known this for a long time, are of course circulated around the globe. So those changes are affecting all of us. And as it turns out, places like Fort Nelson are going to be changing a lot more in terms of climate from these greenhouse gases than places south of us. So we're as you go further and further north, for example, even into the Arctic, the effects of climate change are going to be much, much more extreme, and in fact are much more extreme. In latitude. Yeah, so like, I don't know if you've looked at global change models for climate, and the changes are more extreme as you go in to the Arctic Circle, basically, and the Antarctic. So the yeah. That's right. You're right. And the Fort Nelson is more in the interior. It's more boreal, so yeah, right.
Slightly warmer and slightly better, I think, is the message that I take away.
Yeah.
Provincial and national reports.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass to this area.
But with a lot of variation, and it's those variations, those global averages, or even regional averages, don't always tell you everything you need to know. What we're finding out now is just more the amplitudes. So What are the low years, like the drought years? How bad are they? They're likely going to get worse. The wet years might get worse as well, much wetter. And then there's the sector social, health, however you want to break this down, economic, so this H should be there. However you want to break that down, there's all these environmental issues, air, soil, water, which are sort of the really foundational sort of physical elements that can change. But you get into biota, you get into wildlife, ecosystems. That's where it's much more difficult to model and predict what's going to happen. Okay? Because they're being affected by this, and this, and the changes in those over time. And so these higher level ecosystem parameters, especially living things, tend to be much more difficult to predict than just these physical things of air, soil, and water. Okay. So we want to integrate across time. So here's this figure just looks at, moving with that industry. You need to consider the past. What happened before that industry applied for its license to operate, not just the present. And then what's going to happen in the future? We need to have some better ability to model what's going to happen in the future. And then, of course, it's integration across sectors. I'm calling these industries, but you could also call them just effectors or agents of impact. So, for example, climate change could be one of these, not an industry. But let's just say there's 3 industries. The intersection of those can be quite tricky, and that's the thing that I think gets quite difficult. That area-based assessment that we just saw from the province. It really is not clear to me how they're computing these interactions between very different effectors and so on. And maybe Lana, you'll have something to say about that. So this is I guess CIRC had this done, right? This is just a GIS map, and so it's pretty high level. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But these are the natural resource industries, and not all of them, but some of them major projects here, cattle infrastructure, major highways, forestry cut blocks, oil and gas, and gold and mines, and just sort of mapping those out. And that's interesting in and of itself when you look at the amount of that, particularly in this region in the Northeast. But then we can also add in other things like the right-of-ways, transmission lines, railways, roads, pipelines, and then you can see obviously a whole bunch of a different layer of information. And so I'm not showing you anything I'm sure you haven't seen before. So I'm just going to, but again, the cumulative impact, that's where it gets tricky. I think this was assumed that if 2 of these effectors overlap within 500 meters, you said? 500 meters. So, okay. So it's pretty raw, but so it's just meant even when you consider the interaction of 2 of these things together, you can see that it's not pretty red. And I've seen others from the Blueberry First Nation and Lana from the Fort Nelson, and you'll have a nice, I think you're going to have a movie, right? A QuickTime movie maybe of change over time. So I'm going to leave that for now. But at any rate, it's clearly an issue up here. We've done that for a while. Okay, so here's some things that I think, maybe I can add a few things here that you haven't, or maybe stimulate some discussion, let's put it that way. Here's the challenges. One is the narrow understanding of effects and thresholds. Okay, and many of you have already spoken to this. Primarily, these associated with environmental change and a small number of VECs or valued ecosystem components. So that's what a lot of the ADA process, the provincial process is narrowing this down, I think, to a fairly small number. And the other thing is these projects are proponent-driven through the EA process, at least in BC. So there's potentially some challenges there. This is being proposed often by industries, corporations from outside of BC, and again, how does that interface with the actual people that live on the land here? Industry driven. So they're saying, here's our project, we'd like approval.
I really think it's safer.
So there's a little portal, they enter their thing in, we want to drill a well here, when can we start? Yeah. And lack of thresholds. This is a big issue. Many of you have raised this. Many of you, maybe we've all thought of this weakness, and I think it's a huge weakness for me. These should be, from an ecologist standpoint, these need to be conservative. These can't be working on the edge, right? These need to be really conservative because of the uncertainties in our understanding of the effects and the interactions of effects and impacts. Okay? So just a few quotes here from a recent paper by Denker et al. They did a review of environmental assessments globally, but with more of an emphasis on the Canadian EA process. The literature is clear. Thresholds cannot be defined for VECs or value ecosystem components. It will be impossible to assess significance of the cumulative effects. So there's a real gauntlet being tossed down, I think. And then they also say physical thresholds, for example, air, water, and soil, and I alluded to this earlier, are much easier to find or develop than biotic and social thresholds. Okay, I won't go into that in detail here. I don't want to, again, I'm taking up too much time, I think. Second thing is limited spatial and temporal scale of assessment protocols. CEA primarily limited to a project footprint, which is often has nice little, neat little boundaries around it. The baseline is generally unknown. That's a huge problem. Many of you in this room have raised that issue before. We don't know what the original conditions were. We're usually already dealing with a very well trampled earth in these spots. And they may already be affected or influenced by other developments, and we just don't have the data for that, those baseline conditions. And a lack of clarity around enforcement and requirement for long-term monitoring. There's usually a lot of fuzziness and hand-waving in there. This little box at the bottom says monitoring. Well, who's going to do that? Who's going to get paid for that? Are they going to be arm's length from industry, or is it going to be industry doing its own monitoring? I have huge issues with the latter. Okay, that monitoring, it can be paid. It should be paid by industry, but it should be done by arm's length assessment. So here's from Daman et al. Some CEA methods, in their opinion, are deficient in at least 6 ways. Many of you raised these issues. Data not available. Over-reliance on quantitative modeling. Okay, can you really distill all the information that's relevant into quantitative data? I don't think so. Methods difficult to follow or duplicate. Approaches to assessing significance of CEs is limited. Lack of time and money, that's a huge issue. And just capacity, human resources. We hear it all the time from First Nations too. They just don't have the capacity to deal with the influx of requests. And 6, method complexity. Can't be understood by the agency or the public. So this is a problem. As a scientist, I see this all the time. I see these models. They put up beautiful maps, but I have no idea how they come to those numbers. The assumptions are usually missing, or they're vague. Okay, so assumptions are a huge deal in every model that I've ever seen, and oftentimes they're hidden somewhere. They're buried and not accessible. Third thing, weighting and valuation of positive and negative impacts. So industry always says, well, and government says, let's not forget that some of these impacts are positive, right? That's well and good, but how do we compute and weight these positive and negative social, environmental, economic impacts across temporal and spatial scales? I mean, we're talking about real complexity in modeling, and it has to be heuristic. It has to be human thought, human value driven in terms of how we possibly can come up with an answer here. Potential impacts and interactions between impacts difficult to compute or model. And I think that's really important to recognize. We need to have a huge amount of humility when we try to model these things. I see way too much hubris. I think these maps are just far too seductive. And finally, ultimately, project decisions are typically political ones, where weighting of impacts becomes more value-based and objective than from a scientist standpoint, where we would hope that data would play a bigger role. But the thing is, ultimately, a political agency is going to decide that we can overlook, we can overlook the bad stuff because we think we should go ahead and do it. Get a quote from Dunker and Gregg from 2006. Whereas in theory, environmental impact assessment is about environmental protection and BEC sustainability, in practice it is about project approval. And I think that's something that's been broadcast loud and clear by the province, and it is an issue. It is an issue. Finally, this is the fourth of the 4 points, mitigation and remediation. I have a big issue with this. I'm an ecologist. I'm not a restoration or remedial ecologist. I don't look at that kind of thing, but I do keep track of the literature. I do talk to colleagues that work in that area, and I can say, in reality, mitigation of negative impacts and remediation attempts range from imperfect to impossible. Okay, so we have to recognize that. That is the humility I'm talking about. Science doesn't have ways of turning back the clock any way than we have looking forward in time. We can't. For example, the efforts that I've seen to restore forests to the tar sands are laughable and incredibly expensive per hectare. Okay, oil spills. We've just had an oil spill on the coast. How has our first-class response been doing in cleaning that up? I would argue very poorly. Mine tailings ponds, a huge issue. What do we do with those things? Usually the mines go bankrupt like overnight, and then there it sits, right? Higher level restorations of fisheries and primary forest conditions, I've not seen it yet. So again, this is in theory sounds nice, but we can't do it. Mitigation the second point, mitigation can fall more on individuals and taxpayers' shoulders and less on limited liability partnerships and corporate entities, which again, they amalgamate, they dissolve themselves, they have many arms and tendrils that they cut off when they need to. And so I think what happens is, this is from a very recent piece by this Colorado environmental agency that looks at fracking, and they're saying fracking operations pose a staggering array of threats to our environment and health, contaminating drinking water, harming the health of nearby residents, marring forests and landscapes, and contributing to global warming. Many of these damages from drilling have significant dollars and cents costs, requiring financial assurance up front, i.e. before drilling occurs, helps ensure that public is not left holding the bag when the boom is gone and drilling operators have left the scene. This is a huge issue. Not just an issue in the U.S., it's an issue here, and I can see it already an issue here in this region. Yeah.
From a natural scientist perspective, I'm interested in your take on not just the success of research, but also the time lag and how to accommodate for the long period of time that ecology is not as necessary.
Right. Well, that's a huge issue. That's a good point. It can take decades, centuries, millennia. Some of the damage that we've seen inflicted on the Earth will never be repaired, but much of it will take perhaps thousands of years. Now, imagine thousands of years. Do we have that time? Given all the other, major challenges we're facing, do we have that time? So just a one-page slide on this project that I'm involved in. So CIRC has many projects. I'm going to wrap up, okay? So all I'm going to say is this. I'm going to simmer all this down to this. We're working on a project that hopes to, and we're in communication with the current BC government CEF team. So we're hoping to keep those channels open, because to us that's really important. And so far they've been really wonderful at working with us at arm's length, obviously, because we're independent. But our next project meeting is November 1st, and what we really want to do is kick the tires on the CEF that the province is coming forward with. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from others here about what they think about this framework, those that have looked at it. And we're going to make all our products available to you. So we have a postdoc, postdoctoral fellow working on this now. She only just got working on this in September. So just for brevity, we'll get back to you on that, okay? If you're interested in that, please get in touch with us. Concluding remarks. We must listen to our long-term stewards of the lands, and I think mostly of our First Nations elders and leaders, but there are other long-time stewards as well. And I think we really need to listen to them. The provincial system seems very top-down to me. I know that may be not what was said, but I think it looks very top-down. And I think what the First Nations are telling us and the leaders are telling us is that they want to be more involved in the creation of the data and the models. And I think I agree. Strive to be sustainable in all ways and long-term. If humanity doesn't figure out how to be sustainable, then it is a very gloomy future. And I think we can do it. Truly consider cumulative effects and impacts. Invest in renewable resources. So things like forestry, which I'm tangentially involved in through my forest ecology work. We need to think about the renewable resources and not consider them as expendable things that we send seismic lines through to do these non-renewable resource extractions. Turn wasteful linear systems into circular ones. We have to stop this linear system, this consumption and then creation of waste and putting it out by the curb. It's a very bad system. We have to minimize waste and harmful pollution. Many of the communities up here are dealing with pretty high levels of pollution given how pristine this area should be. Share resources equitably, nature versus human, for example. Humans now use up about 90% of the Earth's productivity, leaving about 10% or less for wilderness, for wild animals and so on. And we need to avoid creation of sacrifice zones. I think the provinces allow this to happen, and it's out of sight of Victoria, but it's certainly in our part of the world, we see a lot of that. And so finally, just thank you for all of you. Sorry to take up so much time. And I'm happy, we'll bypass the questions, and I think probably would be best to do that later. We can just feel free to contact me later if you have an interest in this or want to interact with our group. Yeah.
Okay, so the next presentation for the day, which will actually just be the fourth and the last, is from Lana Lowe with the Fort Nelson First Nation, and I believe Lana works with the Land Department of Fort Nelson First Nation. Yeah, and Alistair McDonald from the Firelight Group. So come on up and they will take the stage.
Just to advance slides here. So it's just this little arrow at the top here. So we'll leave a little arrow, feel free to just click away. If that works for you. And then just for the folks online, it'll be helpful if you can see yourself in the frame, chances are they can hear you. Or you can sit too, yeah. I don't need that. I don't need to grab a chair.
We have to sit close together.
Okay. You don't need to see.
You have to make this.
Okay. All right. And that's it.
Okay. Well, first off, I'd like to welcome you all to Fort Nelson First Nation Traditional Territory. Thank you for coming all this way to have this amazing discussion. So our presentation is going to focus on cumulative effects from our perspective. We'll start with who we are as Indian people in the territory, talk about why cumulative effects matters to us, our experience with cumulative effects over the last decade or so, some of the concerns we have, and our approach to dealing with these concerns. So we've done a lot of amazing work over the years with Alistair from the Firelight Group. We started working with the Firelight Group back about 5 years ago, and we hired them to help us get through an environmental assessment process. And it was very clear early on that cumulative effects, cumulative impacts can't be assessed through existing regulatory frameworks, including EAs. So the work sort of developed over the years into a place where we find ourselves now, which we'll talk about. But yeah, so Al's been with us for a long time and helping us sort through these issues and try and come up with a way to deal with cumulative impacts, and particularly in the context of our human rights.
Thanks for the introduction, Anna, and I really appreciate being in Fort Nelson and in Fort Nelson First Nation territory again. We talked about how we want to deal with cumulative effects, and it can be kind of a depressing topic. We thought, maybe we should focus on all the problems that we've had with cumulative effects assessment, whether it is at the provincial level through initiatives like the LNG Environmental Stewardship Initiative, or in dealing with the fledgling area-based analysis and dealing with the way that the Environmental Assessment Office in BC and the federal EA system deals with cumulative effects assessment, which is very poor. We thought we'd do all those things that ARC did, and we're really glad that we decided not to, because then our presentation really would have been from us. Many of the issues that ARC presents are issues that Fort Nelson has had to deal with in environmental assessments. And in things like the Boreal Caribou Implementation Plan. There are so many different instruments that have been developed. Right now we have the Peace Bayard Moose Management Plan, the Northeast Water Strategy, the regional strategic environmental assessments that some Treaty 8 nations are undertaking through the provincial process. And we have Natural Resources Canada and the Cumulative Effects Monitoring Initiative. So many different things that are ongoing, it can become somewhat bewildering. But what Fort Nelson generally agrees upon is that none of them have made improvements on the ground yet. And that's the biggest concern, because things are being lost at a very rapid rate. We talked about woodland caribou as a canary in the coal mine for other ecological values. I also think of the Dene people as a bit of an unfortunate canary in the coal mine as well. They're people that have been reliant upon forest for thousands of years, the amount of area where they can have that enjoyment. I think the term that we used earlier was peaceful enjoyment, a proxy indicator for their ability to feel unalienated, to enjoy the use of the large tracts of land that they needed for these thousands of years to make their daily living and to practice their culture. Those things are being eroded. I feel unfortunate to be in Fort Nelson because I work with other First Nations where those rights have almost completely been eroded in the lower mainlands, in places like the Peace Country, where the level of impact is higher from industrial, agricultural, residential, and there's still opportunities in Fort Nelson, but that window is closing quickly as well. So what we want to talk to you about today is how Fort Nelson has gone from critiquing what other people are doing to focusing in on not just cumulative effects assessment, not just counting deck chairs on the Titanic, but actually managing change.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
So we'll start with just giving you guys some background about who we are. I mentioned that you're in Fort Nelson First Nation Traditional Territory. This is our territory. It's in the Liard River watershed basin, southern Denende. We are separated from our Dene relatives in the north by the 60th parallel. But we are culturally and family related to the people in the north. The Liard Basin, the rivers flow north, and our culture and our family ties flow north with the rivers. So we are river people, we are people with the land, and we're also Treaty 8 people. So back in 1910, we signed on to a treaty that everybody's familiar with. You hear BC talking about Treaty 8 a lot. But we have an Aboriginal treaty right to our territory, and this is a constitutionally protected right that has primacy over all rights, including economic development. That means Canadian laws and legislation cannot infringe or violate our treaty rights, and that includes the right to harvest. We are people of the land. Who we are is tied directly to the land and the rivers, and that is something that the Canadian Constitution has confirmed and upheld as a primary right to our people. And part of that right is the harvesting right, and so that's why you always hear us complaining about impacts to land from industrial development. We rely on the land for who we are as people. And we're fortunate enough to have suffered only recently from invasion and incursion of the colonizer way of life in our territory. We have a very strong tie to our traditional ways of being and who we are as Bene people on the land. We have our seasonal rounds that rely on intact and healthy ecosystems, and we want to keep that. We want to keep that going for future generations.
I just jump in there one time. I was interested in some of the ecological timeframes that a natural scientist brings up. As a social scientist, I think of the landscape we're in as a cultural landscape, which means a landscape that's lived in. And it's critical for the people, the Dene people in this instance, Dene Cree, there's a mixture of this going on, to have knowledge of the particular land base that they rely upon. And when we're looking at cumulative effects on culture, we often think in terms of a single human generation, 20 to 25 years, as the time beyond which a change may be considered permanent. Because if the landscape changes, the knowledge of one individual can't be passed on to the next generation. And you've lost that place-based knowledge.
Yeah, and we're at a point now in our history where we are dangerously close to losing that connection. And a lot of it has to do with industrial development in our territory. And I mean, we're trying to find a path, trying to find a balance in this world where we can still be who we are as Dene people in the land, but also participate in the world around us. So finding that balance is part of the work that we do in the lands office every day, and part of the reason why we are trying to manage the development that comes our way. So part of managing for what's important, we came up with, after several years of working with the community and leadership and understanding what's going on, we came up with these are the interests that matter to us the most. Obviously, water is a big concern for us, and a lot of that, not only because we're river people, and you saw that map with the red dots, that's all our traditional villages. They're connected by a river. But also the arrival of shale gas and fracking has created a threat to that. So that's one of the reasons why water sustainability and quality are high on the list of what matters most to us. We also, obviously, because we are close ties to the land, the health and integrity of the habitat and ecology is important. Cumulative effects and impacts analysis and monitoring is something that we discovered early on was not being addressed through the regulatory processes and frameworks, so we started working towards that. Again, it's already mentioned that data collection, we realized very early on that there was no data to make the management decisions that were being made here in our territory. So we start, that's a big interest of ours, is actually collecting data on the ground and managing that data, making it accessible for decision makers. Wildlife management, of course, is important. We're seeing a decline in caribou populations and moose populations. We're seeing an increase in wolf populations. All these things are happening due to industrial development. BC zone numbers have shown that the boreal caribou population in our territory since 2010 has declined by 50%. So that's 5 years. Half the population is gone. Yes. Half the population of caribou because of the impacts that are happening on the land. And of course, and related to that is access management. The road building and the seismic lines are creating access problems not only for the predator, but also humans. So those are the top key issues that we're looking at when we think about land management and cumulative effects management. One of the things that we have done in the last few years, recognizing that BC was in effect leaving our territory as a sacrifice zone. Basically, if everybody who has seen the LRMP for this area knows that our territory, most of our territory is zoned as enhanced resource development. So there's 0.3% of the territory is protected areas. Is that what?
I think it's higher than that. Do we have an image for that?
Okay. So we have concerns, and we started thinking about, okay, well, this is what's already happening. This was back in 2011, 2012, and then LNG's strategy came out in 2012, and we thought, oh my goodness, it's going to get worse. So we did some forecasting, and Al helped us with that. The LNG fueling change, it's available on the website. So we did some forecasting. Do you want to talk a bit about that, or are you talking about
a little bit further on? I think people would love to see the change over time.
Okay. So part of the reason we got to the fueling change report and forecasting is because we were seeing some.
We're going to have a bit of an issue for the folks online, but I got a little hot fix for those of us in the room.
Oh.
The video won't play through this web-based platform, but they'll still be able to hear. They'll still be able to hear you speak, Lana.
Oh.
And the folks in the room will be able to play this really briefly off this slide deck here.
Okay.
So apologies for this, and hopefully we can find for the folks who are online an opportunity to share the video. But
okay.
We're staring at basically a map of Fort Nelson First Nation traditional territory and its change over time.
Yes.
I can maybe speak for this, Lana. Thanks very much to, Fort Nelson First Nation is one of the First Nations that I work with that has the highest functioning lands department and a strong GIS capacity. It was Bobby Consortium from the lands department that pulled together this image, which shows cumulative impacts in Fort Nelson territory using primarily oil and gas emission data. Starts very slowly in 1951. After the Alaska Highway went through, and we're getting into the 70s now, and we're seeing more oil and gas development occurring on the landscape. It increases exponentially again with the increase in interest in unconventional shale resources in the Horn River, Cordova embayment, and more recently the Ard Basin as we move through the 2000s. One of the things that, and you see seismic lines, you see pipelines, you see water withdrawal locations, industrial roads, well sites, and larger facilities like gas plants and compressor stations as well. One of the things that is worth keeping in mind is that, as with all mapping, there are artifacts. Not all these blue areas are completely covered. They're covered with seismic lines, cuts through the forest that may be 300 to 500 meters apart. But it shows a compelling image, I think, of the fact that it's become more and more difficult for people that really did rely on a forested landscape and a wide area of lands for their peaceful enjoyment of treaty rights over time. Lana, do you want to add to that? Those are seismic lines, and they look solid because of the scale of the line. Yeah, it's not a solid development. Those are a series of lines through the forest.
From a cultural perspective, just for some scale, this has happened in my mother's lifetime. My grandma, if you guys know my grandma, she didn't see a white person until she was 12 years old. And that was when the highway was being put through and everything was changed overnight. And so that kind of impact, that kind of change on the ground in one generation is pretty disturbing. So, and it's something that we are trying to get ahead of. And that's why cumulative effects management is so important to us, because of these effects on the land affects who we are. And I'm just going to get through these because we've already heard some of the impacts to what happens on the land because of oil and gas development. We're seeing habitat destruction and loss. We're seeing, impacts to wildlife, negative impacts to wildlife, and we're seeing an increase in pollution on the land. So we're also seeing growing concern about water and the effects of the oil and gas industry on our surface water and groundwater sources. So there's a lot of impacts that we need to manage. We're not saying industry get out, but we're saying how it's being done is not sustainable, and we need to we have time now while industry's away to really manage, figure out a framework how we can do this better than we have in the past, because we see what's coming. And yes, we're in a downturn right now, but they're coming back. I mean, they're hanging on to their tenures, they're coming back. So we need to get ahead of it. And our interest in getting ahead of it is so that we can protect our treaty rights and who we are as Dene and Cree people.
Great. That kind of now we go from the more depressing side of the equation to what we're actually doing about it. Just in that last slide, I don't know if we can go back one. It talks about an issue. I think somebody brought this up earlier. How do you measure these more subjective things? What's a treaty right? What's your way of life? How do we measure these things? And it is difficult, but it can be done. And we see work. Fort Nelson is part of the pioneering work on what we call a sufficiency of resources approach. We've used this in cumulative effects assessment previously with groups like the Carrier-Sicani Tribal Council in relation to LNG pipelines, where they used 17 different indicators that relate to their practice of treaty rights and the fact that they need not merely the presence of wildlife on the landscape, but also a variety of other factors to be in place to enable them to practice their Aboriginal rights in that case in the way that they did prior to contact with European peoples. So these indicators can be generated and these tools can be used and integrated into decision making. So Fort Nelson First Nation is not sticking its head in the sand. It's adopting an ecosystem-based management approach. One of the big concerns that Fort Nelson and many other First Nations have had, they've seen some of the new initiatives, like the area-based analysis. It has some useful indicators. Only 2 of them are currently working. But the decisions remain in the hands of what Sean calls the decision makers. Those are not Aboriginal people. The Environmental Stewardship Initiative came out to much acclaim when the LNG ESI was proposed. And I sat through a meeting in Prince George where people were very pleased at all the money that was going to go into cumulative effects assessment. But there was one proviso, that the data collected was not to fetter government decisions on actual projects. Okay, that was the concern. That has to be, so Fort Nelson is interested in not merely measuring change, but doing something about it and having a voice at the table and making decisions. Another thing that they're doing is adopting a cultural and rights lens. So actually bringing these things into the cumulative effects assessment, getting indicators that are reflective of cultural values and treaty rights practices. I'll talk a bit about the scenario analysis. It is critical to be looking at what do we constitute as reasonably foreseeable. In the current system, a project has to be in the project pipeline. It has to be currently proposed in order for it to be considered reasonably foreseeable. That makes the assessment of a widely distributed system like oil and gas development, which may cover a large amount of the landscape over a long period of time, the assessment of future cumulative effects extremely difficult. There are tools that can be used to generate realistic scenarios and to plan for those changes. Fort Nelson is also using mapping and planning at the landscape level and at more localized scales. So maybe we'll jump into some of those tools that are being generated. the first thing is really just changing that primary focus. Currently, measures for cumulative effects tend to focus in on the ecology area. They're things that natural scientists are comfortable gathering. Fort Nelson is amongst the groups that are trying to generate cultural and treaty rights indicators as well. A real focus not on project contribution to cumulative effects, but on total cumulative effects loading. I noticed that Art talked about some of the work by Grave and Blinker, and they have said for a long time, as has Graham Noble, real experts in the cumulative effects field, measuring project contribution is really just irrelevant. The only relevant aspect of cumulative effects assessment is total cumulative effects load. And so looking at things like ecosystem integrity. So trying to change what we're actually measuring. I am not the best person to speak to what exactly is ecosystem-based management. But you know, Rachel Holt, who works with Fort Nelson First Nation, tells me to say it's an adaptive approach to managing human activities that seeks to ensure the coexistence of healthy, fully functioning ecosystems and human communities. Lana and my job is to work with ecologists, traditional knowledge holders, the folks at the Lands Department, hydrologists, and bring in the cultural perspective alongside the ecological perspective in this ecosystem-based management.
And the ecosystem-based management approach is being, I think, piloted in the Great Bear Rainforest area at BC, and Rachel Holt is part of that. So that's how we found her. So one of the things that Fort Nelson is doing is it's really trying to establish the context in which cumulative effects are occurring. And it's generating information at 5 different levels. And much of this data is available publicly. Bobby and his team have access to wide swaths of GIS data. Fort Nelson will work with proponents to gather relevant information as well. And there are other tools like Hector's BC. Key is not in the tools, the key is in how you apply those particular tools. So there's ecological values available, cultural values, gathering more and more water values, and using a watershed perspective as well, which we'll talk about. And Fort Nelson's also looking at what it calls protection and risk factors. Protection is how much of the current territory is subject to any form of protection, and how strong is that protection. And then looking at risk factors for industrial development. That is, the amount of the territory that's already been subject to degradation or clearing or other sort of fragmentation effects, and the amount of tenure that's available in which these activities could in the future occur. And it's not collecting this information for an academic purpose. It's collecting this information to identify those locations that have the highest priority to manage change in those locations into the future. One of the things that is critical around cumulative effects assessment is that it does need to be scalable. So Fort Nelson has a territory. It doesn't exactly align with this particular map, and I never speak to what Fort Nelson's territory is. But these are study area watersheds that Fort Nelson is currently using in its work on ecosystem-based management. And being able to look not merely at the larger area, but break things down to the sub-watershed level as well can be really important. Because for Fort Nelson, none of these particular locations are sacrifice zones, right? And a watershed, in some cases, is a very good ecological proxy unit to use. Other factors such as woodland caribou range or cores can also be used, but different scales can be used to manage effects and examine effects. Fort Nelson is using that scalability. And so using data, in this case, the scale that was actually used was a mixture of core and range. Now BC is going through a process of revising its woodland caribou core and range. But what Fort Nelson did in this instance was it maps the core and range, and then it looks at the degree of linear disturbance, which can be measured as kilometers per square kilometer. The amount of lines that go through the forest per each square kilometer. And the areas in red here reflect the old
I believe, range of caribou that has got a kilometer per square kilometer linear disturbance that exceeds values known to be detrimental to the health of woodland caribou. And so gathering some of that ecological information to identify hotspots where industrial development is occurring. Oh, I think in this case it might have been 2 or 2.4 kilometers per square kilometer. In some caribou cores, we found numbers that did triple that. So, but happy to talk about the numbers. Well, I think that the cutoff we used probably to go to red was either 2.0 kilometers per square kilometer or 2.4. And so different ecologists measure risks to woodland caribou in different ways. Sorry?
Bobby can answer that. Bobby, do you remember what threshold we used?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Now, oftentimes ecological data is the only data that's available, in part because cultural data is very difficult to measure. Fort Nelson has the benefit of having a hardworking land staff that have worked with community members themselves in a multitude of traditional land use and traditional knowledge studies, collect data on an ongoing basis, and we were able to take that data, including areas that have been identified for priority protection, previous traditional subsistence use, transportation zones, high ecological value areas mapped by community members, and develop heat maps. The heat map is just a proxy metric that helps us understand which areas, in this case within one of the Liard Basin sub-watershed, have had the most use and value for community members over time. They're not perfect metrics by any means, but they help us isolate areas that, when you add it to the ecological and risk and protection layers, you start to get a picture of areas that really require strong protection into the future for more than ecological values. The protection layers, in this case we have only protected areas themselves. We also have other layers like, I'm thinking of the RRAs, as well as management areas like the Musqueam management area. This one only shows actual parks or ecological areas within the territory of Fort Nelson First Nation, and relatively low in that instance. And then the next slide shows some of the risk layers. Now this is just another version of what we saw in the video previously, but we're able to layer all these values over top of one another. Some areas have been damaged to the point where Fort Nelson people feel alienated and can't use those areas already. There's other areas, even within active oil and gas territory, where they may actually still be able to practice those values. And isolating those things is critical prior to making future decisions. So we can come up with proxy metrics, and we were interested in showing this particular proxy metric because it shows in red areas that are greater than 500 meters from roads with no industrial features. And in 1950, from the other map we saw, virtually all of this area would have been red. Now much of the area around Fort Nelson and up in the Horn River Basin, for example, is white, meaning that there has been a lot of activity. It becomes more and more difficult to have that peaceful enjoyment the more white areas that you have in a landscape. And as we mentioned previously, Fort Nelson still has some areas that it can use, but there is the potential in the future for those things to dwindle. We're in an opportune time right now where things may have slowed down a little bit on the industrial side. Fort Nelson does not want to get caught up in a situation again like it was when the Horn River really started moving on unconventional. And everything was happening so quickly that there was no opportunity to plan. It's looking to plan for the future now. And so it's using some of the tools, some of the map layers that we talked about previously to flag areas that have higher or lower risk protection, amount of tenure, ecological values, and cultural values. And we can use matrices like this to identify priority watersheds. And again, that's not for an academic purpose. Fort Nelson's intention with this work is to identify watersheds in particular areas, whatever the management unit is, where different zoning may be required, where we may need to set thresholds for the maximum development activities, the maximum amount of linear disturbance, for example, areas where no additional roads may be allowed. This will also help identify locations where reclamation programs, which Fort Nelson's very interested in, can be prioritized and make a real difference on the ground. Now, Lana mentioned also that Fort Nelson is really interested in looking at the future and doesn't want to get caught short again if, for example, there was a strong rebound in gas prices and a strong move towards an LNG export sector. So a couple of years ago, Fort Nelson did develop what they called the Fuel and Change Project that identified what the government of BC recognized as a credible series of estimates of low to high potential future gas development in an LNG export future coming directly from Fort Nelson territory. So this wasn't all of BC, and they considered the fact that there are other areas like the Montney that are closer to market and have better infrastructure in place and are more actively developed. Develop a reasonable and credible estimate of likely future development to help inform planning in an LNG future. And this type of scenario analysis is critical if cumulative effects truly is going to integrate reasonably foreseeable future development. Happy to chat about that at any point. Go ahead, Lana. And do you want to speak to some of the initiatives that you're currently involved in?
So all that work that Alistair just outlined, is part of the initiatives that we have ongoing in the Lands Department on behalf of the nation. We're starting a Liard Basin Monitoring Initiative. It's a 3-year program with Natural Resources Canada. To start, the first year this year is scoping gap analysis and sort of state of knowledge. What do we know about what's on the land? What do we want to know? What don't we know? And what data exists. So really looking at the state of knowledge as far as cumulative effects.
As a more regional level.
Yeah,
correct?
in our territory in the Liard, because right now the Arcia that was mentioned earlier, that is in the Montney and it's in the Peace River Basin, so we're not involved in that. So we're doing one for the Liard, and we're looking for partners. So we're also working with the industry partners who are still here. We're negotiating some land and water management frameworks, tenure-based. So each company who has tenure holdings in our territory, we're looking at negotiating with them and implementing strategic land and water management frameworks. Because one of the concerns that industry have about cumulative effects is they don't want to get caught up in managing cumulative effects that have nothing to do with their project. So we're taking a tenure-based approach with industry so that within their tenure, we have a pretty good understanding of how we're going to work together on land and water management. And part of that is resourcing for data gathering, and there's another industry has another concern about baselines. We can't do baselines, but we just agreed to start where we're at and start collecting the data. We piloted that with Apache, and Chevron has taken over. There was no water monitoring work system in the Liard, so we negotiated that we would have a water monitoring system set up in the Liard in Apache, then Apache's tenure, funded by Apache. We had training to make sure that we could install the system and maintain them and collect the data. And all of that data now sits with the Lands Office. We own the water monitoring infrastructure. It was bought for us by Apache. Any further expansion needs to be negotiated with Chevron. So we're really working to try and get industry on board with meeting some of the concerns that we have about cumulative effects in our territory. So it seems to be working well. I mean, there's not a lot of incentive right now because the investment is low and people's budgets have been cut significantly. But the negotiations are ongoing, and we're really trying to take advantage of the downturn to get the frameworks in place and collect the data.
You missed this slide.
Right?
Yeah, and I fast forwarded it, but one of the things that I think people will be interested in is the aggressive reclamation activities that Fort Nelson's getting involved in. It's certainly a big concern for Fort Nelson. There is a trend, for example, in the Boreal Caribou Implementation Plan for a need for, say, a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio of reclamation activities on old linear disturbance to replace new linear disturbance. That ratio of greater reclamation than new disturbance is reflective of, I think, an ecological understanding that it is questionable how successful things will be, and there's also a long time lag in the amount of time it takes to rebuild ecological integrity. But Fort Nelson is directly involved in doing that reclamation work.
Yes, so we are piloting some habitat restoration work here. In preparing for when oil companies come back, we are establishing a native plant nursery with Ed Cobbett in Springtime Gardens. We just harvested some native plants that are culturally and ecologically important to us, and so they're being propagated now at the nursery. A couple of years from now, we'll have some native plants that will be used in restoration projects. So it's something that's being funded by Environment Canada, and we're hoping it'll be a 3-year project at least. And we're hoping that once Environment Canada resources and partnership fades away, that industry will step in and be a champion of the work as well. Cranberries, we've got all native plants, so we're not propagating any invasives.
Yeah, we're basically trying to get the fruit process all the layers, and that picking the ends and looking at the restoration that things that are quicker to establish.
For sure, all the trees and yeah, we'll get roads and some
and we're always looking for partners, and so I mean we have some resources, but again, capacity is always an issue, right? We have some funding, we have some people in the office doing really good work, but we're stronger if we work together, and I think we can really find a way forward if we all work together on this, because it's not something that the nation can do on our own.
So even 5 years ago, the vast bulk of cumulative effects assessment work was done in environmental assessments. Fort Nelson has been involved with that. Has real concerns about it. Has real concerns about the way it's been integrated into the regulatory process. We didn't want to delve into that in the discussion, but we did have a handout for the group that identified some principles from an environmental assessment perspective of how cumulative effects assessment needs to occur, and very much interested in people's feedback, their thoughts on that. But in the end, it is good to see that there is movement, whether it's by government or First Nations, towards meaningful cumulative effects assessment and management systems into the future. I'll let you finish on.
So a ratio of 3 to 1, so like 4 hectares of restoration to 1 hectare disturbance.
So I was just referring to the revised Boreal Caribou Implementation Plan. It is still in draft, and it is currently putting forward either a 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 ratio. 4 to 1 ratio, yeah. And for Now, I don't know if that applies to linear or aerial disturbance, but in caribou range. That is an issue already that's been raised, you know, and Fort Nelson has dealt with that with proponents, is identifying enough viable linear disturbances in which, you know, these activities can occur.
But I think there's some financial offsets, right?
Offsets can be many different things, I suppose. Yeah. One of the biggest problems, I'm an environmental assessment practitioner mostly, and our big deal is mitigation. And to me, the biggest gap in mitigation is almost always imagination. And people saying, well, there's a rule there, so we'll follow that, rather than say, what can we really do to deal with this problem?
Huge thanks. So folks, I think our approach here, I'm the only person who's standing in the way of us and lunch, and I'm mindful of the time, and I'm mindful that there may have been some questions that filtered into the panel over the web platform. I think my commitment here is that we get people fed and we entertain a conversation and a bit of a dialogue and questions and answers and stuff like that over lunch. And we'll do our best to incorporate questions that were brought in from folks in the webinar into that discussion. And for follow-up and stuff, by all means, we'll feel free to follow up with Stefan. I'm also going to include my email and Maddie's email in the little text box in the event that people want to follow up on outcomes of those conversations and circulation of information. So please do follow up with us for folks who are dialing in online. But I do want to say, you know, a huge thanks to all the folks who are presenting some really cool and interesting things that are happening here in Fort Nelson. It's a really nice start, I think, to the conversation. It's really good kind of getting a feel for what's happening and who's doing what, and starting to carve out, you know, how do we make sense of all this stuff collectively? How do we move forward in that conversation together? So it'll set the tone, I think, for the conversation that's going to start this afternoon. So for those of you who patched in remotely, thanks so much for joining us. We'll follow up with links on slides and other information as it becomes available. And to the folks here, lunch is in the process of being served, so help yourselves to sandwiches. I think bowls are coming for soup and everything right away. And once people have food in front of them, we'll kind of continue the conversation and continue the discussion. So thanks so much, everyone.